In Islamic law, how do you handle a command that seems crystal clear? And what happens when one sacred text gives you a general rule, but another one adds a new specific detail? Does that new detail completely change the original instruction? Well, that is the fascinating puzzle we're going to dive into today. To make this super clear, just imagine this. Your boss walks up to you and says, "Rate a report." Simple enough, right? But then later, a colleague you trust pulls you aside and says, "Hey, just so you know, the boss really prefers those reports in blue ink." So now you've got this little dilemma. Is using blue ink now a mandatory part of the job, or is it just a helpful tip? This exact kind of interpretive puzzle is something Islamic scholars have been thinking about and systematizing for centuries. So here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to lay out the problem itself. Then we'll get into the specific principle the Hanafi school of law uses to solve it. After that, we're putting that principle to the test with some real-world examples, stuff like ritual washing and acts of worship. We'll even tackle a major objection to keep things honest, before we finally zoom out and see why all this tiny detail actually matters in the grand scheme of things. All right, so let's take that office puzzle with the blue ink and start using the formal terms. This is really all about the challenge of unrestricted versus restricted commands. You've got two sacred texts. They both seem to be talking about the same thing, but one has more detail than the other. So how on earth do you make them work together? The two key Arabic terms you got to know here are Mutlaq and Muqayyad. A Mutlaq command is totally unrestricted. It's absolute. Think write a report, period. A Muqayyad command, on the other hand, is restricted. It comes with a condition, like write a report in blue ink. The entire issue we're talking about today boils down to this one question. What do you do when an unrestricted command from a primary source like the Quran seems to get restricted by a secondary one? So just to be crystal clear, Mutlaq is a command that's simple, direct, with no strings attached. And Muqayyad is, you guessed it, the exact opposite. It's a command that comes with a built-in condition, telling you how or when or why something has to be done. Okay, so we've got the puzzle. How do you solve it? Well, different schools of Islamic law have their own ways of approaching this, but today we're focusing on a really systematic principle developed by the Hanafi school. And here it is. This is the heart of the Hanafi principle. Now, I know that sounds a little dense, so let's break it down. It's basically saying you cannot use a secondary source, like a khabar wahid, which is a type of hadith, to tack on a new requirement to an unrestricted command from the number one source, the Quran. The original Quranic command has to stay exactly as it is. In short, you don't get to change the original top-tier rule. But, and this is the really clever part, this doesn't mean you just ignore the secondary source. No way. Instead, what the principle does is create a kind of hierarchy. The command from the Quran, that's your core, non-negotiable obligation. The extra detail from the secondary source, you still act on it, but it's treated as a separate recommended action. It adds value for sure, but it doesn't become a deal breaker for the original command. Let's see how this works with a real example. Our first case study is wudu, the ritual washing you do before prayer. And this is a perfect example because it's something so central to a Muslim's daily life. So we start with a primary source, the Quran. It commands believers to wash your faces and your hands up to the elbows, wipe your heads, and wash your feet. Now notice how direct and to the point that is. It lists the absolute core actions, but it's unrestricted. It says nothing about making an intention first or doing them in a certain order. Okay, but now we turn to the secondary sources, the hadith, the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And here we find mentions of all these other things, making an intention, washing everything in a specific sequence, saying Bismillah before you start. So the big question is, do these traditions now change the original command from the Quran? And this table right here shows the Hanafi principle in action. It's so elegant. The two sources aren't just mashed together. They're sorted into different categories. As you can see, the actions from the Quran are ruled fard. That means they are absolutely obligatory. Your wudu is not valid without them. The actions from the hadith, they're ruled sunnat, highly recommended. Doing them earns you a reward, but, and this is key, leaving them out doesn't invalidate the core act of wudu itself. Let's look at another one. This time, we'll talk about tawaf, which is the ritual of circling the Kaaba during the pilgrimage to Mecca. This is a great example because it shows the principle applies to both acts of worship and points of law. So again, we start with the Quran, and the command is mutlaq. It's unrestricted. It simply says to perform tawaf around the freed house. That's it. no preconditions are mentioned at all. But then we find hadith that say you should be in a state of ritual purity. You should have wudu when you perform tawaf. So here we go again. Same question. Does this hadith now add a binding precondition to that original unrestricted command in the Quran? And here, the system shows off another layer of nuance. That the tawaf itself, that remains fard, absolutely obligatory based on the Quran. But having wudu is classified as wajib. Now this is a really interesting category, kind of unique to the Hanafi school, that sits somewhere between obligatory and recommended. It means necessary. So if you omit it, it doesn't actually invalidate your tawaf, but it's a serious enough mistake that you have to make up for it, say, by offering a sacrifice. So it's a much stronger command than sunnat, but it's still ranked below the fard from the Quran. Okay, but is this principle really applied consistently? Because a sharp observer might look at other rulings and say, hang on, it looks like the Hanafi school is adding conditions there, and that's a totally fair question. So let's look at the objections. So the objection goes something like this. In wudu, the Quran says to wipe your heads, which sounds pretty unrestricted. But then the Hanafi school specifies a minimum amount, a quarter of the head. Isn't that adding a restriction? And what about remarriage after a major divorce? The Quran says a woman has to marry another husband, but the Hanafis add the condition of physical consummation. How is that not adding to the Quran? The reply to that first point comes down to a really fine technical distinction. Hanafi scholars argue that the phrase wipe your heads isn't actually mutlaq, unrestricted. It's what they call mujmal, which means unclear. An unrestricted command is clear on what to do. An unclear command is ambiguous on how to do it. Wipe your heads is unclear on how much of the head to wipe. So in this case, a hadith isn't adding a new restriction, it's providing a vital clarification to a command that was already a bit vague. And for that second objection, the answer is all about the meaning of the Quranic word itself. When the text says she must marry another husband, the scholars argue that in this very specific legal context, the Arabic word for marry already implies full physical consummation. So the condition isn't seen as some external thing added on from a hadith. It's understood as being part of the very definition of the Quranic term in the first place. Whew. Okay, we've gone through some pretty deep legal reasoning there. But why does any of this academic stuff really matter? What's the bigger picture here for how someone actually lives out their faith? Well, when you zoom out, this one principle shows us a really remarkable and systematic legal philosophy. It creates a crystal clear hierarchy for the sacred texts. It builds this flexible framework with different levels of obligation, distinguishing between what is absolutely essential, what's necessary, and what's recommended. And this completely transforms religious law from just a flat list of rules into a dynamic interpretive system. It's a method designed to honor every single sacred source while still maintaining a logical, coherent structure for a believer's life. And that leaves us with one last really crucial question to think about. When a person's religious life isn't just structured by a simple list of do's and don'ts, but by a layered system of the essential, the necessary, and the recommended, how does that actually shape their day-to-day life, and maybe even their relationship with God? It's a profound thought to end on.